666.
There's a lot of talk about water these days in Saudi Arabia. Of course, first, we'll be talking about what everyone talks about all the time, the weather. There's lots of rain coming down across Saudi Arabia right now, actually. A few reports of some flash flooding in Jeddah earlier this week and some last week. We have videos showing rain in Mecca, elsewhere in the kingdom. Steady stream of rain in Riyadh. It's, according to my weather app, drizzling there right now.
Well, and kids are out of school.
Just about to say schools have moved to online learning. No, please. It's a good, your timing was perfect. Students have moved to online learning across Saudi Arabia to put safety first for parents, which is interesting. In the US, just, interrupting myself, snow usually cancels school here. But the further north you go, the more open schools tend to be when it snows because they're used to it. Just the same phenomenon in Saudi Arabia with rain. There isn't a lot. So when it comes down, flooding is a serious risk. So safety first. Segueing into the water sector in Saudi Arabia, there's been a lot of investment and transition in the water sector. This is necessary given Saudi Arabia's growing population, major investments in tourism, new developments in and around existing cities like Riyadh, and new mega cities. Richard, you almost certainly remember. If you don't, that's okay. I wrote a piece for Sustig back in 2013, 10 years ago now, which absolutely blows my mind. I actually went back to read it. I found it was actually cited as a source on a book about water in Saudi Arabia called Arab Water Security, Threats and Opportunities in the Gulf States. I was so stoked to see that. I screenshotted it and sent it around like I'm some sort of genius, which I am not. The piece that I wrote, and we sort of worked on it together, was highlighting the kingdom's water challenges and how they really needed a national plan for consumption, production, conservation, and it was in the works. As you remembered, Richard, back then they were sort of phasing out wheat production and just making huge changes to agriculture because they were drawing down on aquifers too quickly. And of course, drawing down on aquifers too quickly with not a lot of rain coming in, is not great. I will get back to this in 1 minute, but first, two reports out this week. One, a new report out from the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, SWCC. It's a sort of quasi-government or maybe even totally government-owned corporation. They call it a position paper addressing water security in arid and water-stressed regions. We will include that paper in the show notes on both Apple, iTunes podcasts, and also for our YouTube users. It's worth a look. Not terribly detailed, but very interesting. The second paper, released ahead of the World Future Energy Summit, highlights the significant private sector prospects in the kingdom's water sector. The paper underlines Saudi Arabia's potential to spur private sector growth in the water sector as the country deals with the rising water demand brought on by economic diversification, population expansion, and urbanization. By 2027, the kingdom's desalination capacity, which is essentially taking seawater, removing the salt, which is a energy intensive and very complex procedure, is anticipated to more than double from its current level of little more than 3 million cubic meters per day to 7.5 million cubic meters per day by 2027. Interesting too, on sewage treatment facilities, 147 of them spread out over the nation. The Saudi government is also spending money on nearly 15,000 kilometers of wastewater collection networks. So I think just kind of stepping back, a little bit of a big picture here, we're sort of in a water transition for Saudi Arabia, which was ongoing before Vision 2030, but just like everything else, sort of accelerated everything that has happened. And we're on the more mature side of what they're doing there, and starting to get some recognition for it. And that has led Saudi Arabia to explore farming and agriculture opportunities abroad, mainly for wheat, but for import from places like Ukraine and in Africa, but not just wheat, alfalfa, other things that they're essentially growing abroad and importing into Saudi Arabia. They have been doing that a lot through the company Almarai, which is the largest agriculture company in Saudi Arabia. And recently, Almarai has been at the receiving end of some bad press in the United States. The kingdom's largest agricultural, tough word to say, company, has a subsidiary in Arizona called Fondomonte. Fondomonte. I think. See, look, I mess up pronunciations in any language, so it's not an Arab thing.
The Arabic term. Yeah, they just named it in Arabic.
just everything's just kind of gay. I'll just put that in there. They've come under fire. There was a New York Times report and then a local sort of report blasting Fondomonte really for its use of groundwater in Arizona, where it's very similar to Saudi Arabia in terms of climate. Not a lot of rain. Everybody's draining the aquifer and the groundwater. So I dug into this a little bit because it sort of seems like an interesting story. Saudi Arabia farming in a very similar climate to its home climate and then importing back into Saudi Arabia. I saw, Richard, I don't know if I shared this with you or maybe you already saw it, but there's an interview in a local website of Arizona called High Country News with a geographer named Natalie Koch, a professor at Syracuse University who grew up in Arizona, studies the Arabian Peninsula, actually. And she had some interesting context and thoughts on this issue, it's the classic issue where, Americans are upset that Saudis are stealing U.S. water and then growing crops and sending them away. Kind of easy to get upset about. But what she said was part of what people are so upset about, especially people in Arizona, is that the farm is producing alfalfa, a hugely water intensive crop. But Arizona has cultivated alfalfa for a long time because in the desert, you can get multiple harvests in a given year as long as you have enough water. Then she goes on to talk about some of the historical context, which is cool. Almarai, as we know, is headquartered in Riyadh. The farming industry has really been important in the kingdom since 1930. When 1930s, when King Ibn Saud wanted to development, the U.S. government sponsored a team of Arizona farmers to go over in 1942 to share their experience of growing alfalfa and all the water extraction techniques they had mastered in Arizona. Then it circled back, she said. King Saud and his family made a royal visit to Arizona. They did this whole tour of Arizona, agriculture, and looked at the Arizona dairy industry as well. King Saud went back to Saudi Arabia, pushed to set up a dairy industry there. What we see now is the legacy of that, but it's not only the connection, but that's not the only connection between Arizona and the Arabian Peninsula. She goes on to really highlight all the sort of random Saudi U.S. connections in agriculture and water development in their arid spaces. So really interesting. I'm going to actually include a link to that as well. It's a longer interview and there's a lot of context in there. So water. Water is my one big thing right now in Saudi Arabia, from the weather to the all the work going on by the government and now the investment opportunities in the private sector they're pushing. And then, this issue that was raised in Arizona, highlighting sort of what Saudi Arabia is doing from an agriculture standpoint. Very interesting stuff.
It is, and that was an article in the New York Times, so it'd be paywalled. So, but it was excellent. And this was, I think, at the beginning of December. End of December.
Yep.
And it should be noted that the article pretty much talks about Fondomonte's activities and so on, but does not lay the blame at the foot of the Saudis. She talks a lot about Arizona, long-standing Arizona water laws, and people can get you can as deep as you can drill a hole. If you can get water, it's yours.
Precisely. Yep.
And it's it is indeed, it is sort of still the Wild West, and so the Saudis are sort of a minor player among a lot of people who are trying to take advantage of sort of the very lax water restrictions in Arizona, which is it's counterintuitive given the shortage of water, but that's the way it is in the West and in many places. So it was an interesting story. I thought it was actually, despite the headline, there's always clickbait. The headline: Arizona's race to the bottom of water wells with Saudi Arabia's help. If you read the article, it is good because it talks about Almarai and Fondomonte, but it doesn't it talks about the systemic issue that's caused by Arizona, regulatory requirements or lack thereof. But anyway, water. Yeah, your piece. You're a celebrated author, which is good.
I'm a cited author in the field of water in Saudi Arabia.
It's extraordinary.
Which I just found out 7 years later.
It's extraordinary, when you talk about their drive to more than double their cubic, million cubic meters of daily output salinated water, desalinated water. And I think, and we also talk about waste management. It's funny how all these tie up. I mean, there's a reason Jeddah went through a horrible period, and there people lost their jobs. Companies were banished or fined, where they simply could not handle water runoff. Flash floods, poor municipal works, poor sewerage. It's just a real problem. And I think a lot of what this is happening, and it's important. It's probably later than it should have been, is quality of life issues are coming into play. Waste management, water management. When you're looking at Riyadh and Jeddah in particular, part of the commitment that the government is making to its people is that quality of life is going to improve, which means you're not going to have a flash flood anytime there's a spring rain. You're not going to have garbage in the streets. You're not going to have wastewater runoff. And interesting, again, this is a big stretch in the corollary. They've significantly stiffened their sort of pollution laws. In other words, your littering laws. Reminds me a little bit. Remember the Keep America Beautiful campaign way back when we were kids? I looked into that a little bit. It actually started in the 1950s, but we only know it because we remember that Indian who was not an Indian with the tear coming. He was
crying. Yeah.
And as it turns out, he was not Indian. It was all, but typical U.S. It was, a marketing thing. But it brought to the fore an awareness of it. Increasingly, you're seeing that in Saudi Arabia. Take pride in your country. Don't litter. It's a quality of life issue. Anyway, that's kind of a bit of a digression from what you're talking about. But it all sort of ties together, and they're all sort of trying to head to the same spot, which is an improved quality of life in every aspect.
It's funny, Richard. I don't think that there is a single article or piece on Saudi Arabia that comes out on a holiday or at any point in the year that you don't see and know about and have read totally, because you nailed it with the New York Times piece. It came out right around Christmas. So right. I remember seeing the headline and being like, oh, here we go. And then reading the article later being like, oh, so the U.S. military is the biggest offender over there. Right. There are other major big ags just going into the ground. The problem is no regulation. Just kudos to you, because as soon as I saw you start responding, I was like, oh, he's read this. Yep.
You're the cited, expert on it.
That's true. Yes.
So clearly, I'm just hanging on to your coattails.
Well, real recognizes real here. I can't even say that with a straight face. But it's interesting too. I remember flash floods were sort of an issue, and they've been an issue in Riyadh too, but they're an issue in San Francisco right now. They're getting these atmospheric rains that are dumping an unusual amount of rain, or a sort of, it's an anomaly. Even if it's an annual anomaly or whatever, it's flash floods happen all over the world, and Saudi Arabia, you're right, with the Jeddah story, there was even sort of anti-corruption investigations and stuff to sort of clean that up. But really interesting. And yeah, I think that once you get past the headline on that story, you're like, oh, so Almarai and Saudi Arabia is just the convenient whipping boy, as it always is in a story that really isn't about them at all. Yeah.
Put Saudi in the headline, you'll get some views.
Yep, exactly. And that's one of the things that we do with our newsletter, Richard, every day for 15 years now, is get beyond the headlines and really digest every single news article that comes out, not just news articles, position papers and academic studies, and digest and sort of organize them for our readers. So it's just a great resource.
This article, we were back at it December 28th. So this article would have been the December 28th issue of the Sister Review. Subscribe if you don't already.